Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kevin Karami, and I'm a Dean Student Ambassador at the UC Riverside School of Public Policy. I'm delighted to welcome you all to today's webinar with our special guest, Ms. Marisol Franco, the Director of Programs at the Women's Foundation, California. But before we begin with our speaker, I would like to first spend a few moments going over the format for today's webinar. For the first part of today's online event, Ms. Franco will give a presentation. Afterwards, at the very end, we will open up some time for questions from my fellow students and the audience. Audience members, if you have any questions you would like to pose during the Q&A session, please do not send them via chat, but rather the Q&A box below. Audience members can submit their questions anytime throughout the seminar via the Q&A feature. You do not have to wait till the very end to submit your questions. I will then pose your questions to Ms. Franco directly once we reach the audience Q&A portion of today's event. At this point, it is my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker. Once again, Ms. Franco is the Director of Programs at the Women's Foundation, California. She is responsible for leading the curriculum and program development at the Women's Policy Institute. She is a WPI alum and believes all people have the right to a living wage, healthcare, education, and affordable housing. A first-generation Mexican/Xicana-identified intersectional feminist, Ms. Franco was the Associate Director and founding member of the California Latinas for Reproductive Justice. She graduated from Yale University with a BA in Latin American Studies. At this moment, I will pass it on to our guest speaker. Ms. Franco, the floor is now yours.
Thank you, Kevin. So great to be here. And I will, that is not it, sorry. Okay, let's try this again. All right, everyone. Thank you for bearing with me. And thank you so much again, Kevin, and the student ambassadors for inviting me to speak to you all today and the UC Riverside community. I'm really thrilled to be here to talk about my work and the work of the Women's Foundation California in regards to gender justice and policy. The Women's Foundation of California is a statewide, publicly supported foundation dedicated to achieving racial, economic, and gender justice by centering the experience and expertise of communities most impacted by systemic injustice. You'll hear me saying that many times today. And what I mean by saying that we are publicly supported is that we raise all the money that we give away or use for programs like our Women's Policy Institute. We were founded on the belief that those who experience injustice are also those who are best suited to help develop the solutions that will work in the context of their communities. We are defined by a feminist, intersectional, progressive, multi-issue, movement-building approach, and our core values as an organization are community, justice, and well-being. In our work, as this slide shows, we invest in community-led organizations, we train community-based leaders in policy advocacy, and we connect key partners to advance racial, economic, and gender justice. We do this by providing grants to community-led organizations, training community-based leaders through our renowned Women's Policy Institute, and by fostering a community of advocates, donors, policymakers, grant makers, academics, and many others through convenings to share knowledge and strengthen the social justice movement in California. Today, I'll touch upon the train component of our work, but if you have any questions about other pieces, please feel free to reach out. So first, before I get into our work, let's define what I mean by gender and gender justice. So gender is a socially constructed concept that refers to the behavioral, cultural, or psychological traits typically associated with feminine and masculine identities, even though we know there are more identities beyond that. Gender identity is one's internal sense of being male, female, neither of these, both, or other genders. We all have a gender identity, and as a reminder, as a social construct, gender and its role in society really varies from culture to culture. So for us, we recognize that gender justice then is the systemic fair treatment of people of all genders, and as well as equitable opportunities and outcomes for all. This recognizes that gender oppression operates on all genders, not only cisgender women. And we know that gender has a primary impact on societal and cultural expectations, and that gender influences the actions of individuals and institutions. We know that gender has a primary impact, in applying on the cultural expectations, and that gender influences the actions of individuals and institutions. And it's also important that we recognize that gender roles are different among cultures, and that cultural differences and histories around gender are important to consider. Our gender analysis was developed through since 2017 through a process with community, and these are the two most deeply held values that emerge from this process. So the first really focuses on who we serve. For many years, like many other women's institutions, we spoke exclusively about women, and by women, we usually meant cisgender women. Nevertheless, we know that people who are transgender often experience violence and discrimination at much higher rates than cisgender women. So to say women when we mean cisgender women reinforces the idea that trans women are not women and contributes to the erasure of trans identities, and also reveals that women's organizations have not always been allies to trans communities in the struggle against patriarchy, misogyny, and homophobia. As a result, we've begun to take greater responsibility for our language, to say cisgender when we mean cisgender women, and to include other communities in our language when we're talking about gender overall. Today, the language we use is that those directly impacted by gender-based oppression include transgender and cisgender women, genderqueer and non-binary people, and transgender men. Now, the second statement is about which communities we lift up and center in our work. Sexism, patriarchy, misogyny, and homophobia work in concert with racism, white supremacy, classism, ableism, ageism, and so on. The effects of these systems of oppression are compounded for people who hold multiple marginalized identities. And so we'll get into the intersectionality. The Third Wave Fund says gender justice can only truly be achieved when all forms of oppression cease to exist. So at Women's Foundation California, we recognize that gender-based oppression disproportionately impacts transgender people, people of color, queer people, low-income people, differently able people or disabled people, incarcerated people, and people with incarcerated loved ones, youth, and the elderly, and immigrants. This can be shown more clearly on this next slide. Because we know gender oppression has a compounding impact on people with historically oppressed communities, we can't view gender in a silo. Let's look at addressing the wage gap as an example of a need for an intersectional lens. So Equal Pay Day this year will be March 24th, and that's Equal Pay Day for all women, which means that overall, women in the US are paid 82 cents for every dollar that a man who works full-time year-round makes. However, Latinas still earn the least. The Equal Pay Day for Latinas is almost 2 years after. So for Latinas to earn the same amount that a white man does in 1 year, Latinas have to work almost 22 months because they earn 55 cents for every dollar. Focusing on women and race and ethnicity alone is also not enough. We have to consider all these other factors. For instance, trans Black women would still be left behind because of the intersecting factors of race, ethnicity, sexuality, age, gender. We also know that other issues not commonly associated with gender also have a gendered impact, as we're seeing the effects of the current pandemic. Hence, an intersectional gender lens needs to be embedded in our approach to policy research, in our bill language, and in our coalition building across other identities and issues. We see how commonplace it is for gender to be overlooked. I see this in our WPI program. Most of our fellows do not come from what you would think of as traditionally women's organizations or gender-based or issue-based organizations. Because we are a multi-issue fellowship program, most fellows really come to us from other segments of California's social justice movement. And many arrive without having ever been asked to apply a gender lens to their work, despite the fact that as issue area experts, they already know anecdotally and instinctively that people impacted by gender-based oppression are usually affected disproportionately by the issue they work on. So it's really important to connect these movements through an intersectional lens, because that actually increases their power. A small piece of the beauty of having a gender inclusive approach means that we're actually more than 50% of the population, and that cisgender men are actually the minority. So by making our policy advocacy feminist, intersectional, and multi-issue, we're planting the seed of a powerful, broad-based, integrated social justice movement. And as a Women's Foundation, a large part of our role is educating those with whom we have relationships with on what gender inclusivity looks like and what intersectional feminism means. And because of our size and visibility and the positioning of our platform, we are able to educate legislators and people of influence to shift the conversations and bring more people to the table. We do a lot of that work through our Women's Policy Institute. So WPI for short. Through WPI, we are investing in established and rising leaders as well as their organizations. WPI was founded in 2003 to increase the number of community-based leaders who are actively involved in shaping policies that will positively impact the lives of cisgender and transgender women, genderqueer people and non-binary people, transgender men in California. And in 2015, we expanded by launching a second institute to focus specifically on local policymaking. When we embarked on developing WPI, we did so out of the recognition that we needed to support leaders and organizations in making more structural changes through policy. They are the experts of their communities and are doing amazing work on the ground and know the issues well, but there was a disconnect with the policies being passed, and we believe that it was because they weren't at the table. And as the common saying is, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. So we spent more than 2 years conducting research, talking with stakeholders, and designing this nationally recognized program. WPI exists because Black, Indigenous communities of color, immigrant communities, especially women, transgender, and gender-expansive people have purposely been excluded from the process. And this is by design. The systems of policy were not set up to include us. And so at the core, WPI affirms that those who experience injustice are best suited to develop the solutions that will work in the context of their communities, and they need to be at the table. By training the fellows to become public policy experts, we are building the capacity of their organizations to find viable community-specific solutions to injustice. Most of the fellows we train go back to their organizations and educate their colleagues, as well as lead public policy and advocacy initiatives. As a result, we're really fueling the larger gender justice movement, not just individual leaders. A note about our class, the demographics are majority people of color. In the WPI state class of this year, 87% of fellows identify as Black, Indigenous people of color, and the 13% identify as transgender, non-binary, or two-spirit. To date, WPI yielded tremendous success. We have trained over 500 leaders in public policy. We have 59 bills that have been worked on by our fellows, have been passed by both houses of the legislature and made it to the governor's desk. And of those, 43 bills have been signed into law. And we do this with the mentality and approach that we are passing these skills on, that public policy should be accessible to everyone, and that we are doing a transferring of tools, and it's not from a paternalistic perspective, and it's not in a hierarchical way as much as possible. WPI has had much success. As Kevin said in my introduction, I'm an alum from 2006 or so. And so these are some of the significant legislation that fellows have worked on in recent years that were signed into law. So through this, you can see that we address issues of community health, criminal justice reform, economic security, reproductive health rights and justice, and trauma services and prevention. We recognize that all of these issues intersect, of course. And you'll see that in 2017, we had that bill that was passed in order for transgender people who are incarcerated to petition for a legal name and gender change. That was also by our first all trans identified team who worked at the intersection of trans justice and criminal justice by successfully passing SB 310. And all of these may not have happened in a year. So we say WPI was a one-year experiential program, but once you start WPI, your project is yours until you're done. And sometimes that takes a lot longer. So for instance, SB 24 had its first iteration in 1 year, and then it became a 2-year bill. And then after it became a 2-year bill, it made it through the process finally, was passed by both houses, and then made it to the governor's desk. And unfortunately, Governor Brown decided to veto it. And so that was really unfortunate. But we had to reintroduce it the following year. Governor-elect Newsom had said he would have signed it if he had been governor. So he did become governor, and so we tried it again as SB 24, reintroducing it, and this time it actually was successful, passed, and signed. So why do we need, let's back up and talk about why we need to include a gender lens. So I'll be going over some data points, but I just want to recognize that it won't paint the whole picture. You need to consider some caveats. And first, as a socially constructed categories, oftentimes we erase identities that people hold. So for example, when looking at Latinas, you can overlook that there are Black Latinas and Asian Latinas and white Latinas and so on. In addition to that, there's a lot of exclusion. So we know that research is primarily broken down within the gender binary, and there is very scant data, unfortunately, on trans, genderqueer, and non-binary people. And we need to support efforts to improve data collection on gender identity. Lastly, we have erased identities. So for example, the erasure of Indigenous people who are categorized as Latinas, but they do not identify that way and have very different experiences. For instance, many do not speak Spanish, even though they're assumed to by a Latina marker. And by erasing them, we're overlooking their specific needs because, for instance, when you break down the Latinx category, you'll see that some subgroups are actually doing much worse in certain areas and have other needs. So as we look at the demographics, we need to consider that for all of these indicators, it is likely that undocumented women, Indigenous women, trans and non-binary people are all faring much, much worse. This is just a snapshot. As we can see, women still face persistent barriers to accessing economic security, job opportunities, and representation in elected positions that greatly improve their lives and the well-being of their families and communities. Women and girls make up just over 50% of California's 39.5 million residents. The majority are women of color. And women of color are underrepresented in leadership positions. So as progressive as California is made out to be, that doesn't translate when we look at gender equity. The current state legislature actually ranks 18th out of all 50 states for its percentage of women serving. And this is actually one of the highest percentages of women in the legislature in California history. So for us to rank 18th in the nation, and this is one of the times that we have the most women in the legislature, is pretty sad considering we consider ourselves so progressive. And then you look at the percentage of CEOs of Fortune 500 in California. It's the same percent nationwide, 7%. And then you look at, women who hold management positions in California, less than 1 in 3 are top executives. So, and that data hasn't really changed much since 2010. As you can see, occupations continue to be gendered, and we see women are underrepresented in STEM that lead to higher paying careers. Homelessness is also a really big issue in California. It was before the pandemic and became even worse during the pandemic, and people were scrambling to figure out what to do with with people experiencing homelessness. And so pre-COVID, 1 in 3 of the 130,000 people experiencing homelessness in California were women, and just over 1% identified as transgender or non-binary, and nearly 13,000 were domestic violence survivors. We know there's a gendered aspect to experiencing homelessness. Now we know that this is a snapshot, again, talking about women. So for transgender, genderqueer, non-binary people, we know that this would look very different. And despite there not being large enough data and large quantities of data, we do know that 90% of trans people report being harassed or discriminated at work. 1 in 5 trans people have been homeless. And 41% of trans people report attempting suicide, compared to 1.6% of the general population. So we have a long way to go. Let's look at it from an intersectional lens again and look at disparities and inequities by race and ethnicity. So we know that racism leads to many of the racial disparities and inequities that we see. Looking at the mortality rate for women in LA County, these are the ones that really rise to the top. Looking at the overly high rates among Black women of maternal mortality, which are 4 times higher than the rates for women. This is a real statistic that with real people behind it, and it's not okay. And emotions are totally welcome because this is appalling and alarming and needs to be addressed. It's important to note also that the higher rates of maternal mortality among Black women cut across all socioeconomic lines. So we've even heard Black women who are celebrities such as Serena Williams talk about the negative experiences they've had giving birth. Racism is what's causing these disparities. Now let's take a look at poverty. Take a breath, y'all. Take a breath with me. So overall, California is has one of the largest economies in the world. I think we're 5th or 6th. We usually go between those two. And overall, we have 14% of California women experiencing poverty. But when you break that down by race, again, you see that Black, Native, and Latina women have the highest rates of poverty. We can easily see that this is demonstrated by the wage gap. So I talked about the wage gap before, and that was nationally. So Latinos in California have the widest wage gap across age, ethnicity, and among Latinas in the country. So nationally, Latinas earn 55 cents for every dollar a white man earns. In California, that number is only 42 cents. I want to go local again and talk about comparing some communities, looking at Riverside and Marin County. We partner with the California Budget Center, Budget and Policy Center to develop the California Women's Wellbeing Index. The Women's Wellbeing Index provides a comprehensive composite measure of how women are faring in each of the state's 58 counties. And it looks at indicators within each of these areas. So the areas are health, personal safety, employment and earnings, economic security, and political empowerment. The Wellbeing Index then ranks each county on each of the areas and provides a composite result as well. What you see here are the rankings for Riverside and Marin County. So overall, Marin County ranked at the top, which is why I use Marin as the example. They ranked at the top overall with an index of 74.6. Riverside ranked 48 overall with a score of 48.0. We see that Riverside ranked 34th among the 58 counties in health. Personal safety was 11. That's the highest it ranked out of all of it. Employment and earnings, 51. Economic security, 41. And political empowerment, 49. As when we see Marin, which is one of the wealthiest counties in California, if not the nation, you see they're all in the top 5 for all the indicators. And this index really tells a story. So let's look at what that translates into. And let's look at it from the shoes of a mother in Riverside. The median wage for a woman in Riverside is $40,500. The median cost of rental housing will eat up 38.9% of her annual earnings, which is about $1,300 a month. That leaves about $2,000 to cover everything else. And so then you consider childcare costs, because that's probably the next biggest thing for a mom. They have childcare, other think of transportation, healthcare, other necessities. Food is not on there. I missed that one. Food should be included in the everything else category. So childcare costs in Riverside is 65.9% of a single mother's median income. You think about that. How are women expected to make the ends meet? They're not. If you look just at housing and the childcare costs, it's 105% of that woman's income. And the ramifications for women are they are having to make impossible decisions and negotiate what can be put off to pay for down the line. So it's no wonder then that so many women in Riverside are experiencing food insecurity at 40.8%. It also shows up in women delaying healthcare. And that can also mean, for instance, not being able to obtain a wanted abortion in a timely manner, or not being able to pick up your prescriptions for your mental health, even if you have some access to healthcare. And for some, it can mean that they can't afford health insurance. As we see, we still have 12.5% of women in Riverside County that lack health insurance. Any other necessities? Take the back burner. This means foregoing things like clothes, education materials, personal products, things that are actually necessary. This also means needing to rely on the safety net, on friends and family to be caregivers, on local and private charities for food and things like clothing and other necessities. Now, when you consider the implications for a low-wage worker and what their experiences might be in the workplace, there are things that we need to consider. For instance, they may not be as ready to report sexual harassment or assault in the workplace because they need that job to survive, because their housing is almost 40% of their income. And then if their child gets sick and they need to leave work or go to the doctor, they'll lose pay because they don't have paid sick leave. They have to consider whether they can take the day off. Passing a mandate for 3 days of sick leave in California a few years ago was a challenge. And coalitions have been working diligently to include emergency paid sick leave during COVID, but it has not been a guarantee. And they have had to push for it in the budget each time. If we actually took a gendered approach to policy, this would be a no-brainer. Women are usually the primary caregivers, and our workplace policies just are not supporting them and geared towards cis men. Lastly, when housing costs eat up more than a third of income, we know that any unanticipated economic or health issue or cost can push people into homelessness and because it threatens their housing. And all of this was before COVID. We just walked through alarming data, and that was describing conditions before COVID. The fractures in our systems not only became even more blatantly obvious during the pandemic, but they've actually grown. This quote calling the COVID-driven economic downturn a she-cession acknowledges the gendered impacts of the pandemic. The fact is that women are bearing the brunt of the burden. Women have experienced a disproportionate number of job losses since the start of the pandemic. From February to May 2020, 11.5 million women lost their jobs compared with 9 million men. Again, we know the data, with and without the data, that women of color, undocumented women, transgender, genderqueer, and non-binary people have been faring worse during the pandemic. For instance, in April 2020, at the height of the pandemic, the unemployment rate for Black and Latina women was 16.4% and 20.2%, respectively. These losses are further jeopardizing communities of color, as Black and Latina women are more likely to be the primary wage earner in their families. It is clear that California must center women in an equitable economic recovery, and particularly trans and cisgender women of color, in order for California's recovery to actually be equitable and robust. So let's leave the data behind and now start talking about what is possible. How do we address this? Historically speaking, policymakers have been mostly cisgender white men, and this has not changed much, as you saw in the data. So it should come as no surprise that we have had to fight really hard for paid parental leave, basic health care, comprehensive sex education, affordable health care, overtime pay for domestic workers, and countless other basic policies. I won't even get into the past 4 years of the federal administration attacking all of the gains made in women's health and civil rights. This moment really calls for bold steps. This is the first time since 1948, for instance, that the unemployment rate for women has reached double digits. In order to make up for those lost gains and actually improve the conditions for all genders, we need to reimagine policy and think outside the box. So usually in policy, they talk about incrementalism, which is necessary to improve things. But we really need to go bold and think outside the box and talk about universal childcare, talk about paid family leave, talk about basic income, talk about universal preschool and kindergarten, talk about free college education. So while the federal government and the rest of the country remain very polarized, California right now has the opportunity and responsibility to do better. I'm not saying that We do not have our fair share of conservatives and moderates in our state. But in order to address gender equities, we really need to think more boldly and push our elected officials to actually make California the progressive bastion of hope that it is seen as in the rest of the country, but not always reflected in our policies. In policy, we often have to consider the policy window, right? And to determine whether something is movable. But I would challenge that, because what often dictates whether a policy is movable is not whether it'll work or whether it's going to do well and do good, but how much it will cost. And you have to look under that, because it's not really about cost. If it was about cost, we would have universal healthcare in this country, hands down. There are plenty of research reports out there for the past, 20, 30, 40 years that demonstrate that universal healthcare would bring down costs of healthcare for all. But what it would cut is profits. And so that is really what's driving what is movable, what is, think about Prop 22 and the gig economy. 85 was passed at the state legislature to provide basic protections for gig economy workers. It was not a perfect law. It had a lot of different pieces that were that needed to be improved. However, you had, multi-million-dollar corporations think, well, we don't want the legislator to tell us how to run our business, how to treat our employees. So they ran a proposition to repeal it and basically created their own law for their own corporations by pumping so much money into our very flawed ballot initiative system in California. We have to really start thinking about how we cut into those costs, how we cut into those influences in policy. And in order to do that, we really need to organize. And so I really challenge you as people who want to work on policy to think about policy and organizing need to go together. So I've talked a lot, and I know with that I want to segue into talking about your interests in policy work. I'd like to leave you with some policy lessons. Some of these are my own, and I've borrowed some from different mentors and other folks that work in policy, because I really believe in the democratization of information and helping each other out, and you'll see what I mean as we go through these. So the first is, policy is an honor and a responsibility. Be humble and make room. Being able to work in policy and in systems change is a privilege and an honor. And with great honor comes great responsibility. You need to recognize your privilege and leverage it to include others that are not at the table. You also want to remember that some of the savviest advocates do not even have a college, master's, or law degrees. You also need to make room. So this is the last time I think I'll say this today. The people closest to the problems have the solutions and should shape them. Research and policy experts, we all have important roles to play in policymaking, and impacted communities should not be excluded. They need to be centered. Centering them does not mean tokenizing them, though, or just using them for their stories to advance your policy agenda. It's not enough to only seek input and their support without letting them actually weigh in a meaningful way and participate. The community needs to be involved in a meaningful way in order for the policy to be most successful. We also know that policy needs maintenance, and maintenance requires vigilance by the community, which is more likely to happen if they actually took part in creating the policy to begin with. Another note about this, though, is that I've seen this happen a lot in different coalitions and things like, when we bring in impacted community members, we have an expectation that of how they need to behave, or like how they need to participate. And that's really rooted in white supremacy, because professionalism is rooted in white supremacy. You have to recognize that impacted community members have a lot going on in their lives. We just saw all this data. They're facing all of that and may not be as readily available or able to participate in the ways that you think they should, or traditional ways. So be open to other ways of participating. That leads me to be curious. Approach things with the curiosity. So there are always multiple ways of approaching an issue. You need to ask questions. Asking questions, as opposed to listening so you can answer and give your solution and say, like, this is why it's the best. Asking questions will lead you to more questions and will make your ideas better and hear even better ideas that someone else may have thought of. And it's important also because it helps you, it actually leads you to additional things. So when you go to someone and to talk to them about a policy or whatever you're working on, and thinking about an idea, you should always ask people that you talk to who they think you should talk to, so that you're actually coming, you don't come across a no. And if you do, curiosity is how you'll find another way to get a yes. So my third policy lesson is be a good team player. There's really enough credit to go around. No one does good policy by themselves. WPI is set up in a team model so that fellows learn how to build coalitions, because the most successful policies are always done through coalitions. The Domestic Worker Bill of Rights, for instance, was led by the Domestic Workers Alliance with support from WPI and the very large and broad coalition, not just labor. You could see it as a labor issue, but it was not just supported by labor. It was supported by a huge social justice coalition. And usually that's what you need, especially when we're talking about things that are really hard and pushing against profits. Always dust your shoulders off and keep going. So you're going to lose at some point. You might lose what it feels like all the time, depending on the issues that you're working on. So for instance, I worked in reproductive justice for 15, I don't know how many so on years. It was really hard to see all the stuff coming out from the federal government and feeling like we just can't win. But you have to keep going. You have to keep trying. Obviously, you can't just give up. And you can't let yourself get pessimistic and jaded to the point that you stop trying new things because you think you're going to fail. For instance, there was a policy in place. Welfare had family caps because of welfare reform from 1996, Bill Clinton era. These family caps came in and basically put limitations on welfare recipients that said that unless you use very specific types of birth control, if you had another child while you were on assistance, you would not receive additional aid for that child. It was a punitive approach based in racist, classist ideas, eugenic ideas about who was having babies supposedly to milk the system. So since it passed, anti-poverty advocates were trying to repeal it. So that was 1996. So it wasn't sometime in 2013, 14, 15, a new group of advocates that were participating in WPI took an intersectional approach at the issue and decided to frame it as a reproductive justice issue and an economic justice issue. And that allowed it to actually gain new momentum, and it was eventually passed. And the reason it passed was because of bringing in different folks. So again, you just got to keep walking. It took since 1996 to 2015 to repeal the maximum family grant. Lastly, it's all about relationships, as with many other things in life, and it's all about politics. So the most critical component of policy advocacy that I found is really developing relationships. And I won't take credit for this one because I just agree with it wholeheartedly. One of the WPI mentors and an advocate in Sacramento has his rules for advocacy, and this is one of him. He says it's important to develop and nurture authentic relationships. And well, this is adapted. So it's important to develop these authentic relationships, not just with people that you think can help you. You also need to be sure that you're helping others without asking for anything in return. For instance, you should be nice to the front staff and the people who are not in decision-making roles. This is often not the case. Before when we could be in Sacramento and we would wait in a hall, sometimes you see some people who were really mean to the front desk staff. And that's just not okay. One, you never know where they're gonna end up. They're also working in policy. And so that's important to remember, like anyone can really support your work. And authentic relationships by nature are reciprocal. And when you need something down the line, they may be more than happy to support you because you were nice, you helped them, you offered resources. If an office needs some information, even if you're not working on the bill and you have that and you can, spend some time sending them something, go for it. You never know. They might then remember you and they're like, hey, you're working on that. Do you need support with that? And then with it's all politics, is that remember that a lot of the policy making that happens is also that these relationships that are also between the legislators. So, not all legislators get along with each other, and you have to consider like egos and different things, and whether they're running for office again or not. All of these things come to play in how we do policy. It's not what we envision when we think of policy, but it's a little bit of a house of cards kind of a mentality. But it is about relationships again. So just as it is relationships with you, again, the legislators have their own relationships, and sometimes the bill will die just because the legislator, there was a bill that was in a committee, and the chair didn't allow one of the bills to pass. So then the rest of the chair, basically, the rest of the committee members basically killed one of her bills. This is what happened. Not because the policy wasn't worthy, it was because of relationships and how they, interact with each other. And I'll end there for today. I'm more curious in terms of questions and really getting into discussion. Thank you all. This is my contact information, and if you have questions or want some information about WPI, feel free to reach out also at the WPI email.
Thank you, Ms. Franco, for such an impactful and eye-opening presentation. I think I can speak for everyone here that we were all really moved with every word you spoke about the issues that hundreds of millions of people face every day. So at this point, I'm going to open it up for questions. I have fellow classmates who you can see on the screen who have joined me as panelists and can ask questions directly to our speaker. But we also have audience members who can submit their questions via the Q&A. So as our audience members are typing in their questions, I'm going to ask the first question. So you mentioned this a few times in your presentation, the idea that California is perceived as this overly progressive state, but in reality, it isn't. Why do you think that is? Why is it that there's this false perception of California, yet people living in the state definitely don't see it that way? Where does this come from, and how do we change it?
That's a really good question. I think a lot of people are trying to figure out how to change that. I think part of it comes from looking at different issues. On some issues, we are more progressive than other states. And so I guess it's thinking of it in a spectrum. On the relative to other states, we might actually be the most progressive, quote unquote. But then when you look at, how we view the criminal justice system, California has always been really bad. We have the third strike law that we just can't get rid of. And so really it comes down to different issues. And it's also thinking about California as like, we have our own sea of red. We're not just a blue state. We have our own sea of red. I have family in the Central Valley, and things are not the same over there at all. And we have just so much. What's interesting is that the population and the demographics are changing, but the power is not. So who holds power is still not changing, and that's what we need to change. We need to change and get people elected across all of California, not just in like the coastal areas.
So we have a question from one of our panelists, Uthman. Go ahead.
Hi. So yeah, first I just wanted to add on to what Kevin said earlier. We could all obviously tell that you're really passionate about everything you're analyzing and studying, and that really came out in your presentation. So my question was, in the beginning of your presentation, when you're focusing more on the wage gap and the gap between men and women, and then women of different races, I was curious about where all this is originating from. So when women are not representing as much of the field in particularly STEM fields, is that because there's more of a pushback or resistance to them entering that field in the first place? Or in primary grades, middle school, high school, are they being pushed towards different fields instead of STEM fields? Do you feel like there's different ways that maybe California or other states around us can push women to enter more of those fields and perhaps closing the wage gap? So yeah, basically to summarize, what can we do with women and girls at a younger age to push them into these fields where they're not representing as much of the workforce?
That's a great question. And that's not necessarily my area of expertise, but our CEO talks a lot about closing the wealth gap. That's one of her areas of expertise. What I will say is that it's all of it. It's systemic. It's gender bias in the hiring. When you have one woman and like 9 men, and out of 10 applications, it's not going to go to the women. Studies show this. There's plenty of data around gender bias in hiring in STEM and beyond. And then the same gender bias exists from the moment we enter school, from the moment we're born. And so this is the air that we breathe, the water we swim in. We have gender bias, patriarchy is just part of the problem. I mean, it is the problem. And so it's all of it. So it's reaching and making sure that young girls are not pushed out of thinking about STEM, and actually creating pathways, making our education system more geared towards different fields. And also, so it's about valuing the work that women do. Why are the fields that women are in the most undervalued and underpaid? Teachers are mostly women, and they are really underpaid, and people are okay with this. Why is that? They have just as much responsibility as any other job. They are working just as hard as anyone else. And yet they're blamed for the conditions, and they're blamed for the pay that they're getting, even though there's this idea of this meritocracy of like, if you work hard, then you earn more, but that's not true. And so if you look at caregiving and all again, looking at the fields and that women are concentrated in and the gendered occupations, they're always paid less. And that's not a coincidence. It's just women's work is undervalued overall.
Yeah, and I just want to echo, I think those problems exist, and it's going to take a lot of work like the Women's Foundation is doing to solve them. So we have another question from a panelist, Andrea.
Hi, I did want to say thank you so much for your presentation. This is an area of study I'm very interested in. I've taken so many gender study courses. My favorite one I have to say is Black feminist theory, which like touches, like this is the core of it. I did want to go off what Uthman had said. I know I had taken a class which mentioned women are right now, we're like the ones that are mostly going to entering higher education, yet we're the ones that are, we're still not seeing the pay gap being closed. But a lot of that is because we're going to like the social sciences. But again, that has to go back to being introduced into STEM at a younger age. My question's gonna be completely off guard from this, but I just did want to like touch upon that. You did mention you're from a Chicana background, and I did want to ask, as someone who comes from also Chicana background and is very conservative, also like sometimes the Chicanx community is very conservative. How do you think gender should be introduced into our community? Because we have a very patriotic way of looking at gender. It's like just strictly feminine and masculine. There's only like the two binaries. There's no flexibility in between or spectrum. They don't see, it's hard for our communities to see that. How would you go about that? Addressing it to our communities?
I would have to take my lead from, in regards to, first of all, thank you, Andrea. Let me just take a step back. I take my lead from the trans leaders. So there's Trans Latina Coalition that works specifically among the Latinx community to talk about gender and transgender and the gender expansive folks and how to break that down. I don't have an answer. I haven't broken through that in my own family. And it takes having conversations. I see that a lot, especially, for instance, I worked in reproductive justice. My family, I grew up Catholic. You know, reproductive justice isn't something that they thought of, but then when we would talk about it and break it down in other ways, people can make the connections. So I just feel like we just need to have conversations. Like there's the policy and then there's the actual cultural narrative. And that's some of the work that actually the foundation is starting to really delve deep into is our culture change work. Because one of the aspects of policy is that the cultural change needs to also happen at the same time. You need cultural shift and paradigm shift happening to be able to push the policy shift as well. And that starts with media, that starts with like conversations, that starts everything with like, again, like thinking about novelas used to always touch on all these hot topics, and maybe I'm thinking specifically of my family and what they watch, and yet like every time I put on the Spanish language news, I have to roll my eyes every time about how they speak about issues, because it's just very different. It's akin almost to Fox News. Not so much in the fake news, but like in how they're presenting the news in terms of like how dramatic and you know, overemphasizing a lot of different things. And some media outlets are doing a little bit better job actually talking about these issues, but it's very, very little that I've seen.
So we have a question from our audience, an anonymous attendee. How can we redefine professionalism to include POC women and all genders, especially because the concept of professionalism reinforces white cisgender male dominance in the workforce?
Thanks for the question. I think you do it by showing up and being your authentic self. You know, I've done policy trainings for many years with young people, and I always tell them, you know, we're going to Sacramento, but that doesn't mean you have to go out and buy yourself a suit. You show up and however you feel most presentable and authentic, and people need to respect that. And I think the more folks that are actually in the spaces doing so, the more it will shift. I had colleagues, especially who always pushed against this. I'll share a story of one of my colleagues that we were in Sacramento, and I think one of the women a woman came up to her in the ladies' restroom to tell her that her stockings had a rip, but it was intentional. That was part of her outfit and her look. And, you know, it's like, okay, you know, we're reinforcing it. It's so embedded that everyone is reinforcing it. And so I think there's places like, for instance, the Crown Act that former Senator Mitchell, now Supervisor Mitchell, passed to the legislature. So there's things being done in policy to push back against this white supremacy model. And then there's just more of us showing up and not just replicating the same culture. We need to stop replicating it.
Yeah, definitely. So our next question is from another panelist, Maddie.
Thanks, Kevin, and thank you, Ms. Franco, for being here. And this is, you know, as a woman, I think it's important that we continue to talk about this topic because it impacts every one of us. I'm curious when you mentioned, you know, universal family leave, universal pre-K or universal kindergarten, kind of where we stand on that. I've heard the idea floated around, but I'm curious realistically, whether it's the state of California or nationally, if this seems plausible, and if so, if there's a time frame.
Yeah. I think that with COVID, everything has sort of become all the issues have been exacerbated, but also just by the nature of how work is getting done right now, less is getting done. And so I think that issue, like universal pre-K or trans PK and all of that, was a very strong priority of the legislature. So both the Assembly side and the Senate pro tem have that as their agenda to expand preschool. And the governor also came in with a really progressive agenda, and with a really great budget proposal last year that just all got derailed. So there's folks are talking about like this is really important, especially in COVID, because we've seen how how parents are having to just navigate schooling. So I'm not sure where it stands, but I would say that it will come back, and that depending on our recovery and how California's revenues turn out, I think that issue will come back and be probably at the top again.
So
that's me holding like a magic ball and trying to see the future.
I wish we all had one. So we have another question.
Can I just add one thing? I will say that childcare is actually pushed right now and has much more momentum around like expanding childcare, because that is such a huge issue right now. It's shrunk so much. There were already long wait lists for like subsidized childcare, and so that is one of the issues. And Parent Voices is really leading that work at the state level.
So we have another question from our audience, an anonymous attendee. I just want to say that the presentation was very impactful, and I'm so glad to have listened in today. What would you say as college students are the first steps we can take to further support and get involved in these gender equity policies / issues?
I would say to start following the organizations that are doing the work. I know we follow all sorts of people and influencers on social media and beyond, and organizations are figuring that out and on social media as well. And so really looking at the organizers that are working on the ground on these issues. There are a lot of really great people who are pushing and changing norms. And I feel like part of that is also helping shape the cultural narrative. And I think that's one of the steps you can also be taking. How do you help shape the cultural narrative? Because you're also not just consuming social media, we're also, putting it out there. And there is sometimes content overload and too many mediums, but how are we able to, within our circle, create that culture shift?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think everyone can definitely learn from it. So our next question is from another panelist, Arlette.
Hello, Ms. Franco. My name is Arlette. Thank you again for your presentation. It really opened up my eyes, and I guess is what my question is kind of going to say about that. So I know you were mentioning thinking outside the box when thinking of policy, and I'm currently taking an environmental policy class at UCR, and we're looking at command and control about pollution. And so I guess my question is, do you think we're able to control market when it comes to gender policy? And I think the first step is either like raising the minimum wage or decreasing the price of contraceptives for women. I guess environmental policy can be very controlling in markets, but are we even able to do this and this type of policy?
Sorry, what was the last thing you said?
If we're able to kind of control the market or the economic market when doing gender policy, if that's even possible to think outside the box.
And especially when it comes to environmental and climate justice, there are actually some of my friends in policy, my close allies, are doing work at the intersection of like reproductive justice and environmental justice, because those two are super linked, because the environmental impacts on our reproductive system are really terrible. And everything from toxins in beauty products to, so in those ways we can control the market. How do we get, toxins out of beauty care products? And I think it goes back to how much we're willing to make things public goods and cut into profits. We're still in a capitalist system. How can we most regulate for equity, regulate the markets for equity? And it takes a lot to do that. And because there's a lot of corporate pushback. They can probably push forward a ballot proposition if they don't like how something is, as we've seen with Prop 22. That was a terrible precedent. But I think that people, that corporations also want to have a good public perception. So how are we inviting them as well, so that yes, it's an adversarial relationship, and at the same time, there needs to be communication and ways to regulate the market. I don't know if that answered the question, but I think there is. I just think it's really challenging given our capitalist system. And in some places, it might actually be easier to do some local work than state work, and do sometimes policy gets passed by looking at local pilot examples, and then you can then demonstrate look, this is really working. Let's do this somewhere else, and let's extend this to the rest of the state. So that's always something that we talk about with our WPI, is thinking about, maybe not starting so big, but starting at this small intersection to try something new, and then use that as the pilot model for something bigger.
And I wanted to follow up really fast when you're talking about corporations and nonprofits kind of coming together. what has been the challenge within that? And also, what is your opinion on corporations using kind of, these movements, for example, like Amazon giving or fundraising for Black Lives Matter, but they're still not allowing unionization. So has that been a struggle that you have seen in your leadership, and how do you deal with that?
In my experience, we haven't dealt too much with corporations because of just the issues that I really lead on in terms of reproductive justice have not so much overlapped with the, like, for instance, it would be like pharmaceutical companies and such. But with the Women's Foundation, we're always seeking different partnerships to be able to redistribute wealth, really, to be able to fund communities to do work. And so I won't say anything about Amazon and their union busting. Yeah.
So
that's not my area of expertise.
Our next question comes from Daisy.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you again, Ms. Franco, for being here with us today. We really appreciate time and just really overall the information. I think that, again, right, it's not something that is prioritized a lot, right? Even in my own courses, we often neglect looking at policies in a gender lens. And so I really appreciate you just, raising awareness and bringing that up. My question to you is really kind of focused on, how school systems are sort of meeting the needs of working mothers. We know that even before the COVID-19, the majority of women relied on childcare, as you stated, in schools to keep their children safe while they work. But, oftentimes, especially for low-income mothers and mothers of color, this childcare and these resources are unaffordable and they're unavailable. And as a result, mothers tend to leave their work and their occupations. So I really wanted to know, and I'm interested to hear, what are some of the ways, that childcare and school systems can meet the needs of these working mothers, but also not just as a short-term solution, right? And just what's happening right now in COVID, but as a long-term solution, because I think oftentimes we're putting in those short-term just to sort of remedy these effects, but we're not thinking long-term and policy-wise.
Thank you, Daisy. I think you answered your own question. In some ways, it takes childcare. It takes a look at, for school systems to also consider childcare as part of the educational system and the community as a whole. So we have a WPI-Local team in Monterey that is trying to get the school board to pass a proclamation recognizing that what they call FFN, so Friends and Family Networks, because they're the ones that are supporting and providing caregiving and supporting the especially in early childhood education, which is not all day. So when women, mothers are working or parents are working, and your child is, the school is only from like 9 to 12, who has a 3-hour shift? That can do that. And so it's trying to find ways that we can leverage what's already happening in communities. People already have those friends and family networks, and how are we making them a little bit more formal and in partnership?
Thank you.
So I actually want to ask the next question. I want to touch on the point you mentioned in your presentation, that there are issues with data collection and studies. And I think you mentioned like exclusion of certain people or some identities being completely void. What are some steps we can take to change the way studies are conducted, and maybe even eventually prevent these issues?
That's a huge issue, especially for the research community, because there's so many, usually it's research within academia. That's probably one of the largest areas where research happens, right? but there's also the state has its own research mechanisms. And so I think it's easier to start with the state in some ways because you can actually legislate. And I think academia is trying to do better in certain pockets of disaggregating data more. I think there needs to be more community participatory research to be able to actually reach communities. And there's something also about the way data is in terms of like, you know, sample sizes and being able to report on things that are qualitative versus quantitative, and what data is prioritized or seen as valued more than the other. There's a little bit more value placed on quantitative versus qualitative, and that usually requires larger samples. And when you're talking about, you know, hard to reach communities, you know, think about the census. People are undercounted all the time, and that's a huge effort that has funding behind it to try to have people go door to door in most times before COVID. So I think part of it is adding the questions to make sure that people are not lumped together. I think we need to rethink our categorization around race and ethnicity. You know, some of the California data sets already look at race and ethnicity different than the census. And you know, for instance, and then there's some smaller, some nonprofits that are doing research, like the California Center for Budget and Policy, that are, you know, creating their own research based on different data sets and pulling things. And then it's also partnering with some organizations. I just had a conversation with an organization that's national that is a hotline. And so they have so much information about different things that people call about from a very specific community, and no one else in the country has that. So how is that, you know, and they're thinking about, you know, how do we put this out there? And sometimes that is not seen as real research. You know, when I worked at California Latinas Reproductive Justice, we have our director of research who drafted research reports, and it was still not seen as real research because it was secondary data, or we were using different things. And so, our focus groups were too small and not representative according to them. But they had really valuable data that brought out teased out so many issues that you can't see when you're lumping people together to try to get like these broad, to make some broad conclusions. And when you make broad general conclusions, you're going to miss people and you're going to misrepresent people. And that happens a lot, again, with like indigenous communities from Latin America that get lumped in with Latinos or Latinx communities. And that's not the case. They have very different issues that they face.
Yeah, and solving this issue is really important too, because it plays a major role in how policies are passed and what legislators choose to do. So our next question is coming from Andrea.
Hi again. Okay, so I just wanted to touch upon one of the things you said in your presentation that said that we're going to, a lot of policies are going to get rejected, but you just kind of have to keep on going. And it reminded me of this quote. It's from a statement from the Combahee Collective statement. They're like Black feminist organization. It was long ago, like in the 1970s, but they're the ones who started like the women's movement and Black, like specifically women of color. So they did mention, I kind of wanted to echo what you had said, but it says, as Black feminists and lesbians, we know that we have a very definite revolutionary task to perform, and we are ready for the lifetime of work and struggle before us. So that kind of reminded me that that's a quote that always stuck with me when I read that statement. It's kind of like you echoed, we're gonna get rejected, or women's policies are gonna get rejected, or things women propose will get rejected. We kind of have to keep pushing and just continue, just continue our fight. But my question is more going back to the transgender rights and people who are intersex. has your organization ever touched upon or like fought for transgender like policies against like police violence against transgender, or even like prison policies, because like prison or police violence against transgender communities, because I know that is a hot topic. I know right now, like during this past summer 2020, we were seeing a lot of the BLM protests, and it was all in honor of George Floyd, but we also need to recognize the transgender lives that are lost, like especially Black trans lives. Does your institution do anything towards those policies?
Thanks, Andrea. That's a really great question. So we support any policy that is looking at addressing the violence that transgender, gender nonconforming, and intersex folks are experiencing at higher rates. Our policy work is really led by the Women's Policy Institute. So the work that they bring and the alums that continue to do that work. So as I mentioned, when I was talking originally, or in the beginning of the presentation, around like our own evolution around gender, like I feel like we're in an institution that's evolving, right? Our name is Women's Foundation in California, but we're talking about gender justice. And we had to really explode and be explicit about who we're talking about, that it's not just cisgender women. And the WPI has always accepted folks from that are gender expansive, but we needed to make shifts so that people could see themselves going to WPI. And so we have had a growing number of folks who don't consider themselves cisgender come through WPI and work at different intersections, especially and a lot through the criminal justice reform, economic security issues. So I will say that not specifically, like there isn't something specifically that we've been working on to address that issue, but we've been supporting the organizations broadly. For instance, the Trans Latina Coalition, along with some other partners last year, we supported their budget request to create a trans health and equity fund at the state level to be able to support trans folks on the ground. And so we're supporting and uplifting other folks who are leading that work. And that was led by a WPI alum.
So our next question comes from anonymous attendee. I think this is a very important question. So for many decades, the myth of the welfare queen stigmatized Black women as too lazy to work. Do you think that myth is still reflected on this community and contributes to the lack of mutual aid given to unemployed Black women in poverty during COVID?
That myth is, those stereotypes are so deeply embedded that they definitely still exist on so many levels, right? And this is one of the reasons also why, why it's been such a fight for the federal government to continue to provide unemployment aid on a consistent basis, or the uproar that some people who were, by adding $600 to their unemployment, that they were getting more money than they made when they were working. Like, well, that means they weren't getting paid a lot, right? Like, that means they were earning so little that this puts them over. And the idea is that they don't deserve it. And that's all embedded because in the idea of like, who is it and who that conjures up, and that's all racial bias. That is deeply embedded in our society, in our culture from the inception of the US and before that. It's a book, Stamped from the Beginning. That one definitely talks about where racist ideas come from and how they're perpetrated and perpetuated over time. So those racist ideas aren't gone. They tend to change form. So you won't necessarily see welfare queen right now, but that is but you'll see other euphemisms for that. And I'm not sure about the lack of mutual aid that's being given to unemployed Black women. I would love to know more about that.
Just to go off of what you said, I know freeloaders might be a newer term rather than welfare queens, but right before we wrap up, I just kind of have a closing question, if that's okay. You've said that you've dedicated a lot of your career to reproductive justice. I'm just curious if you have any final thoughts for those who may think, following Roe v. Wade, that there's no need to continue this fight. If you just have any thoughts or would like to share any of the work that you've done in your past or even now.
Oh my gosh, yes. I mean, Roe v. Wade only allowed for it to be legal. It did not make it a reality. We have the Hyde Amendment that barred low-income women from actually being able to get an abortion and that is not a law. It is just always included in the budget. That this idea of separating funds, no public funding for abortion. And if the last 4 years have shown us, Roe v. Wade is not settled at all. And it's also just one aspect of reproductive justice. All these other things that we've been talking about, maternal health and access to education and childcare, all of those are reproductive justice issues, because when we talk about reproductive justice, it's about the right to have a child, the right not to have a child, and the right to be able to parent the children that you decide to have in safe and healthy environments. So we have not achieved reproductive freedom, and Roe v. Wade is not safe. We have a terrible Supreme Court makeup right now, and so even though the majority of Americans support abortion access for other people, there's a very strong anti-abortion movement that is always looking to chip away at it and hoping to bring it to the Supreme Court to be able to overturn it.
Thank you. And I just personally want to say thank you again so much for joining us. I've learned a lot, and I just am so inspired by your work and your career. And if I can really quickly, an audience member did send a very sweet note that I just would like to read you. So Brian Latu said, extend our appreciation for her time. Thank you so much for it. It was very insightful. So I would just like to echo what Brian said.
Thank you all.
So unfortunately, this is all the time we have for questions. I just want to thank you once again, Ms. Franco, for taking the time from your extremely busy schedule to join us today for this very important talk. And thank you all for attending. Our next online event will be on Tuesday, March 9th at 12:30, when public policy student Vivek Kakar talks about a new Roosevelt Network chapter at UCR. You can learn more about that and other UCR School of Public Policy events at spp.ucr.edu. We hope to see you all again soon, and bye.